Good evening, everyone. I'm Zoe Sperling, Senior Director here at Hauser Wirth London. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our London Gallery for a live digital conversation with artist Charles Gaines and curator Mark Godfrey as we reopen Charles Gaines' first ever solo exhibition in the UK, Multiples of Nature, Trees, and Faces. The event today is closed captioned. If you'd like to activate this function, click the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Charles and Mark will also take questions at the end of the event, which you can submit using the Q&A icon at any time. The exhibition will be open until Saturday, the 1st of May, so if you are here in London, please book your appointment at hauserandwirth.com to see these incredible works in person. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and it is now with great pleasure I hand over to both Charles and Mark.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and hi, Charles. How are you doing?
Fine, Mark. How are you?
Very good. I'm really pleased to be in this room, surrounded by your work, and to be next door to the other room with the trees. And I'm sorry that you haven't been able to get here because of the pandemic, but I want to reassure you that the installation looks completely beautiful and the works look, amazing in the space. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you about these works. So thank you. I thought I would just tell the audience the format of what we'll be doing, which is basically dividing the talk into two. First of all, talking about one series and then moving on and talking about the other. And the show, which is called Multiples of Nature, Trees and Faces, consists of two rooms, and each room is devoted to a different series. And there's going to be a video now so people can see what the first of these rooms looks like. And as that plays, I'll describe a little bit the first of the series and then ask you some questions about that. Now, both of these series come out of works and series that you've been making since the 1970s, but in both cases there are new changes to the series and to the way you're working. So we're going to start with the room that includes the new series of trees. Now, in most works like this, you start with a large format black and white photograph, in this case of a tree, and you place that black and white photograph in an acrylic box. And then you divide that acrylic box into a grid, and you produce a numeric and chromatic translation of the photograph by coloring in squares and numbering them. The numbers are in one color, like we can see here, green, and the squares are in another, like yellow over there. And the numbers start with the spine in the center of the panel, and then move outwards, going 1 to whatever on one side and 1 to whatever on the other side. And it's very clear when you're up close with the work, and I encourage everyone to come see the show, that these are done by hand. The numbers are written by hand, and each square is individually painted by hand. Now, the works are conceived in series, and each new work in the series includes a new source photograph. Each sheet of acrylic has all the translations of the previous photographs behind the new translation of the new photograph. So if we're looking at the 8th work in the series, we're looking at data from works 1 to 7, as well as data relating to work number 8. And what this means is that as the series progresses, and this is the last in the series that we're seeing now, the layers of data overlay each other and make our view onto the photograph more and more obscure. And in some ways, all of this comes out of work that you've been doing, as I said, since 1975. This is the first set of translations of photographs of trees, the walnut tree orchard works that started in 1975. But in the most recent works, as I said before, the photographs are positioned behind these acrylic boxes, and the gap between the photograph and the acrylic is reasonably thick. It's about 6 inches, so you can peek in from the side, but you can't really see the whole of the photograph. Now, hopefully that will serve as a description to give us people a sense of what they'd be looking at if they were in the room. And I now want to just begin to ask you some questions about this new body of work, because it's different from what's come before. Because what we see here is that the translation on the front of the acrylic isn't a translation of the photograph behind it, but of a different photograph. So what's behind it is a photograph looking upwards at the branches of the tree, but what's in front of it is a translation of a different photograph that's taken frontally from some distance to the tree that shows the whole tree. So this is a departure from your tree series to date, and I just wondered if you can tell us how you came to this departure in this body of work.
Sure, Mark. When I was preparing for the show, Henry Alsop, who at the time was a curator at the Hauser, found out that I was going to have the exhibition there, and so he tried to talk to me into investigating British oaks. He's a fan. So at the time, I was trying to work out another idea, but Henry was very insistent. So we went touring around the London area, and I found these oaks, and I found he was right. The oaks and the British oaks were different from the other trees that I've been working with in the series, and I thought I could do something different with them. And walking through or thinking through that whole strategy of how to present the oaks. And I should say that the series is not exclusively oak trees, but they're predominantly oak trees. When thinking of it, I was drawn to an idea that came from an earlier series of the grid boxes, a series where the gridded translation on the front or on the grid itself covered a painting of the tree in a grid form rather than a photograph. And that painting of the tree was what I called exploded. And that is, it was a close-up of the tree that was translated on the top of the acrylic face. And so I thought that I would try that not as a photograph, not as a painting, but as a photograph. It was as simple as that. And so we did it. I mean, we ran some experiments, and I was happy with the results. And so we took the chance of dedicating an entire series using this process.
So did you take all the photographs that we see here yourself, or were you lying down on the ground and looking upwards?
Yeah, I did not take it. I got this brilliant German photographer to come out to Britain, to London, and shoot the photographs of the trees, and I can't get over. They're really amazing.
So you kind of directed these photographs, but the ones, the frontal photographs, whose translations we see on the front of the acrylic panels, where are those photographs? Because we don't see them here. So did you use them as well, or are they kind of discarded?
No, well, I don't know whether they're discarded, but they become they become the image that's translated, so that I can do the front panel.
Yeah.
And I still have them in the drawer. I don't know, but I'm doing this strategy of exploding the back panel and doing a close-up of the tree right now. And I thought that it was conceptually consistent because of what I was doing with the painted tree image. Yeah.
You know, there's obviously a kind of system in the works. I've described some of it already, but there's also arbitrary things. For instance, the colors that you use for each new panel. How do you arrive at those choices?
Well, years ago, when this idea evolved, it came as a result of doing some investigations or research into other ways of making works of art. You know, they're different from the received ideas of making works of art, which I called operating or creating from what was called the creative unconscious or the expressive unconscious. So that is that artworks are expressions of the subjectivity of the artist, and that it was reliable that the image that's created is actually an effect of that subjectivity, which the subjectivity is, of course, invisible, but it was a visualization of a particular artist's subjectivity. And through certain language of poetry, others can connect with the artist's subjectivity through the work, which gives the work resonance. That's why it becomes beautiful, or that's because it's meaningful, because it's really a communication of subjectivities, between subjectivities. So I thought that was all hogwash. And it probably isn't. I mean, like in the big picture, it's a totally legitimate way of making works of art, and an entire epoch or era of art making was based upon it, which is modernism. But I thought for me it wasn't, and so I realized that what I had to do or try another career was to find another way of making work, and that, which I didn't understand at the time when I was going through this turmoil, that really involved trying to upend the notion of the subject, or the subject's role or influence on making images. And that's where I came with the idea of the system. So as you talked about the image, or the strategies of image making, being the colored squares and the numbers. What that meant to me was that if I gave over the production of an image, and it could be an image that's coming from the world, if I give that over to that image making to a system, then I could find a successful way of making work of art without involving my creative unconscious, which I was very suspicious of. And so the numbers are sort of, as you already mentioned, are ways of marking a difference. And so is the color. So this difference of markings, the marking of difference by color and number was a way of isolating or translating the image of the tree, especially given the fact that I thought that the system had to work within a series that I would plot and track the image of several trees on top of each other. And so the colors and the numbers not only help me plot the shape of the trees, but also help me plot the shape in a series. The consequential marks. Yes, Mark, go ahead.
Oh no, I understand that. I'm just, but the decisions that you make about whether the color should be light red or light blue, those don't come from anything other than your choice, right? Your personal choice.
Yeah, so this involves another sort of a critical notion that would probably put people to sleep, but I'll try it. I make a difference between choice and creative expression. Right. So all choices aren't creative expressions. Creative expression is a very specific type of psychological phenomenon that is built upon a theory of the subject. And choice is very different from creative expression, because we do all kinds of things as a matter of choice that we don't regard as creative gestures. My critique was around the idea of the creative gesture. And so I regard choices and the way that I decide things as the kind of choice that you would make, that are not creative, might be intuitive, but not creative, like should I get up in the morning? Or how do I locate the different categories of my filing system? And those choices are based upon a structure that's based in difference, so that you can separate one thing from another. So I don't regard the choice of blue or green or yellow as a creative expression. I do regard it as a decision, as a design that I come up with in order to implement these choices.
I get that completely. It's different from the kind of subjective decision making that, let's say, our archetypical abstract expressionist painter made when choosing, when deciding to use a green or a purple or a pink against a different color. You're differentiating the kind of choices you make from those subjective decisions that they made. Something else in this series that I wanted to ask you about is the titles. And I think language plays alongside the works in interesting ways, and we'll talk about that in the next series as well. But these are photographs and translations of other photographs of trees that are somewhere outside of London, but they each carry a title which includes a street name, which I believe is in and around London. Is that correct? And how did you get to the titles?
Yes, and I don't know how that choice happened.
Okay.
I just thought, as an idea, and then I passed it by somebody at Hauser, Maisie, and she said, brilliant. So, with that, I decided to do it. The idea also echoes or reflects upon something that's a standard in the work, that I emphasize location whenever I do one of these series. So rather than just, in this case, rather than just sort of generally establishing the location as London, and actually these trees are not from London specifically, but in a region outside of London. Instead of doing that, I became more specific to sort of locate street names to build up a kind of, interesting dialogue around location by applying a certain specificity that I never tried before.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be meaningful to people in London.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I saw a previous show of yours in Los Angeles where there were palm trees that were, again, kind of connected to the kind of trees that one might see there, whereas here we've got the photographs of the oaks. I want to ask a more general question, which is that, in your works, there's this legible system which has its own logic and consistency. And because the system is presented like a collection of ordered data, it gives us the sense that it could tell us something useful. But the numbers, especially when they're combined, end up only telling us about the system itself. It's not like we can learn that much about the tree, for instance, from the translation. And also, as the system continues, we might get more beguiled by colors and surfaces. So the system's claim to give a truth or to be authoritative is somehow undermined as the series continues. And I think this concept of systems undermining themselves is important to you in terms of a general critique of the way the world is categorized and ordered. Is that how you would read the importance of what you do with systems?
Yes, I think you described it beautifully, actually, that in the final analysis, one is or I would hope to become increasingly aware of the arbitrariness between the image that's being produced and the system that produces it. So that, I mean, in our normal perception of the world, we don't see or are not unaware of the elements that produce image in our brain. And so we don't know how the relationship between those elements, those structures and the world itself. In fact, the world itself is really, unknown to us directly, empirically. It's always mediated by the way or the system that we have, either biologically or linguistically, we come to perceive the world. And I wanted to draw a suspicion around the idea of the reliability between those poles, where it's essentially believed that for many that they are reliable, the relationship is reliable. I wanted to draw suspicion about that, and hopefully through perhaps analogy or one can get to the point where it becomes critically important to realize that what the system is producing is different from the image that it is designed to produce, but it is producing something that has its own fitness, its own interests. That to me, explains how ideology works. That we can come up with a view of the world that really has nothing to do with the world. And in the case, where we are there is that we presuppose that it is the world that the ideology is articulating for us, and we operate in the world that way, which is, we don't have any other choice. but it allows you to think that critique is more important because you have to become more suspicious of truth.
You once said, and we'll move on to the faces in a minute, but you once said that you use systems in order to provoke issues around representation. Now, it took quite a long time, I think, before people recognized that your work on systems and your work kind of against the truth of systems was a way of posing critical questions around wider systems, including those that categorize people, including systems of sort of racial difference and I wonder why you think that that took so long.
Why it took so long?
Why it took so long for people to connect your work on systems to the politics that your work always had?
Yeah, well, that's really a good question. And I'll try to answer it, but you are right. I think that the environment around the work, was pretty much framed by the very thing or very set of issues that I wanted to critique in my work. In other words, I really wanted to separate through my work from what was standard practices with respect to the reception of works of art on that level. So I deconstructed those tropes or those practices using the elements of the practices themselves. And so what happens, for example, when people look at the trees, they think they're beautiful. So they think I make them with the intention of making beautiful looking objects. And really I don't. And nobody believes this, but I really don't. But it just so happens that the elements are designed to be beautiful. And so I thought that, like the modernism or the world of art, it's attributing that to some genius of the artist, that they're able to articulate and unpack this poetic beauty in things. When I thought that the manner in which or the tools that you use to make those things are already implicitly beautiful. And so since people come to works of art that way, when I was using those same elements to try to unpack the idea, it's harder to get to my critical interest because I was feeding them the things that they was expecting. And it took a long time, and it's still taking a long time for people to get to the critical elements. I mean, I think at this point, one of the benefits of exposure is that I get to write or express my interest in the work. And so it doesn't undermine the affective relationship with the work, but it places that affect within a critical frame. And I think at this point, at least it's being addressed within a critical frame, as before it was just thought to be about affect and emotion and poetics.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to affect at the end, I think, but I'd like to now sort of move on to the other series of the faces, actually, in the series that I'm surrounded by right now, luckily. And I'll once again try and describe how you've made this body of work and then come on to some questions. So for this series, the first move, as I understand, was that you made a call out for a set of subjects, each of whom identifies or self-identifies as coming from a mixed race or mixed ethnic background. For instance, the child of someone Japanese and someone white. And then you took large format photographs of them from the shoulder upwards and printed them very large in black and white. And then on these acrylic translucent panels in the boxes, you gridded them. And once again, you translate the contours of the faces and some of the internal details like the eyebrows or the eyes, the nose, the lips. And you translate those with a system of colored squares and numbers, once again, moving from the center outwards on both sides. And then each new work in the series includes the new translation of the photograph behind it with all the previous translations of the previous works in the series. And once again, as the series progresses, it's harder and harder to tell anything about the identity or appearance of the person below the plexi. And there are 12 works in the series. The first 12 are, let's call them sort of medium size, and then there's a jump in size for the last 4, which are each much larger but consistent between the 4. Now, I wanted to sort of start, I want to come to the question of why you chose mixed race sitters or people who identify in that way in a minute. But first of all, I want to just start with more generally what you're doing in this series of faces. And again, like the trees, the faces began in the 1970s with the first faces work that you did here in 1978. You have tended to use a kind of photograph that we know from ID photographs, from passport photographs, usually a type of photography that's used mostly by people, by systems of power to get a record of a person. So these are black and white photographs, they're frontal, there's no smile usually. The black background is black, it photographs people from the shoulders upwards. And as I say, the history of this kind of photograph is linked to systems of control, whether it's the state wanting to know your passport photograph or police ID photographs and so on. So if that's part of the history of photography, how do you think that your work was intervening in that history and perhaps being critical towards that part of photography's history?
Yes, thinking back at that time when I was making that work, I did the tree series before I did the faces series, and so the trees are very good models. They just stood there and they just shoot them. A person is a very complicated model, much more complicated than a tree. I was trying to treat the face like I treated the tree, and because the tree was a good model because its structure allowed me to implement this type of system that I've grown accustomed to doing. The face created terrific problems for me at the time. Like, for example, I didn't know, the tree in terms of contour is easy. The faces in terms of contour is more complicated because you have so many choices, or the choice of contour markings are layered. And so you have to make a decision about how very specific you're going to get engaged with the contour markings. And this should have at the time been a clue to me, but I wasn't. What I was trying to do was I was trying to make the face behave so that I could create these sequences. It just so happens that my interest in producing this work of art coincided with that history of photography, where where we have an idea of authority and control with this kind of photography. And in a way, the worst reading of my work is that. I mean, I guess you can say that, I was trying to implement a system of authority and control over the face in order for me to do my series. I didn't think of it that way because I would have been aghast if I thought that was going on. But what I did learn from that, and it was at the time, and I wasn't able to resolve it at the time, was that I was involved with a deeply political subject. I mean, the trees, there's a politics to the trees, because you can talk about like the orchard talks about agriculture, and so there's a politics of control that we can address with agriculture. But I can soften that narrative in favor of my interest in trying to unpack or deconstruct representation. But it was harder to do that with the faces because they were so present. I mean, it was when they were shown in the gallery, they didn't sit quietly like trees, being nice. The faces were all very aggressive, and I didn't know how to, because I didn't give voice to what I was actually observing at the time and what people were saying, because they were bringing all these issues, these cultural and social issues to their experience of the work. At a certain point, after I got into my what I call my language series, where I decided to purposely introduce politics as the subject rather than as an aspect or an effect or as a third layer reading. When I got into dealing with it as a subject, I then began to think of the tree series more politically, and then also in this show, or a previous show, not just this one, but a previous show, I reintroduced the face series called Identity Politics. My idea there was to layer the faces around a theme, which was identity politics. I wanted to, yes.
I just want to stop you to ask something else about layering of faces and photographic history. I mean, most people will look at what's on the image here and understand what we were saying before about, well, what I was saying about the history of passport photographs or identification photographs, but maybe a slightly less well-known thing in photographic history is the history of overlaying in faces. And there's this guy, Sir Francis Galton, who was working near where I'm sitting in Victorian London, who believed that by overlaying many photographs of people's faces, one on top of another, I think he did it by actually using the same photographic plates to photograph multiple subjects, that he could produce or identify the types or the characteristics of particular people. Like he could find out what a criminal nose looked like.
Yes.
So, you know, or he photographed Jewish migrants, he photographed criminals, he photographed those kinds of people who weren't in positions of power. And this was, he was connected to the beginnings of eugenics. And others took off from this as well and used composite photography as a form of trying to identify the aspects of subjects in a way that we might find completely reprehensible today. And I just wonder, you must be conscious of that history and also trying to undermine it when you use your composite translations in a different way.
Yeah, well, as I said, when I was younger, I was dumb. So I was so focused on this conceptual strategy that I didn't think about the implications, and those implications were brought to me. It wasn't something that generated the idea itself. But then, you know, over time, I began to understand from the politics of my tree series how I was commenting on this history. For example, this history of eugenics and this history of authoritative photography or organized photography in order to control. I started to realize that because my intention of using the system of the tree series is to show and demonstrate the arbitrariness between that system of organization and the subject of organization. And so I could see now that by the time I got to the Faces series, that, you know, my political interest in doing that was clear to me and built into the idea of the system, because rather than establishing types, the system deconstructs the mere possibility of types. In the same way that I talked about the arbitrariness between the system, the grids, the numbers, and the object of representation, that we become aware that relationship is arbitrary. My thought that arbitrariness would unpack any notion or any ideology with respect to the way I was treating the subject of the face. And in the earlier series, Identity Politics, I wanted to unpack this notion with respect to ideas, how the term identity politics is being used by the political right to dismantle and disable minority power by calling identity politics simply a trope to get favor when you don't deserve it. And in the series of your show, I wanted to do the same kind of dismantling with respect to the idea of race.
So let me just ask. So can you say how you got to the point of making this call out for people who self-identify as coming from mixed race backgrounds?
Well, it's I mean, generally when I use subjects like this, I just ask people, but since I isolated a theme with respect to this work, what we did was we made a general call, essentially going through people we know and passing the word out that I was interested in people who would be interested in modeling for the series. And the prompt was that I was interested in people who self-identified as mixed race or mixed ethnic identity. So how they define themselves is up to them.
So each person, I mean, in each title, it's very interesting to me that you definitely include everyone's name. And then it looks to me that you ask each person to identify themselves. So one person would call themselves white, another white European, and Levantine white European, for instance. Another person Filipino/Black. Another person might call them Filipino/Black American. The series as a whole gathers together all sorts of ways that people define themselves. And the language element's quite interesting because you clearly allowed people to say how they wanted to be known. Is that what happened?
Yes. So the idea, and we explained that to when we asked people to participate, that I come with no preconceived notion of what mixed race or mixed identity or mixed or ethnic identity is, and that I wanted to find people who simply self-identified. We didn't do this. I mean, nobody came forward, but if you were like Irish and German, you would have been in the series.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I want to ask, I want to pose two completely different readings of this series to you now, and just ask which one you might have some sympathy with. So I'll just be talking for a couple of minutes here. So some people might say today that the pressure to name oneself as multiracial or multi-ethnic is created by those in power, generally white people in power, and that white people do this to categorize and divide other people and divide those out of power. So that when people begin to define themselves as, for instance, Filipino/Black, their political identifications are narrowed. Whereas if they identified as a person of color, they might feel allied with all those who define themselves as people of color. And with that in mind, you could say that the series is a kind of critique on that imposition on people to specify increasingly in a granular way their multiracial identity. So that's one reading. And a completely opposite reading of what to make of this series would be that to say that we live in a moment right now that by celebrating their multiple backgrounds, people can increasingly make a political impact. Kamala Harris might be a great example here, and she was celebrated by African Americans and South Asian Americans who felt a sense of identification and pride as she was elected vice president. And with that in mind, the series might be seen as a great celebration of the idea of multiple identities. So I just want to ask whether which of those two readings, if either, you have more sympathy with, or do you think that the work offers both?
Well, I start out, with the idea that national identity being one thing, but the idea of race is fiction. So I start out with that, and that fiction becomes more complex as we deal with multiracial, or the idea of the multiracial. So I come with this with the presupposition that I'm interrogating a colonial project, that the idea of racial identity and difference is a function or is a consequence of a colonial imperial the colonial imperial past of the European, at least in terms of my own lived experience. And I'm a great fan of Edward Said. And Said had understood something I think was very important, that we actually live in an Orientalist or colonial environment. And we have been subject and framed by the history of European domination. And that's the reality. And so during that process, self-identity, individual voices, that is, becomes a problem because it becomes a problem to define yourself outside of that colonial model. It's very difficult. So Said simply said that what we have to do is take over the colonial model. We have to use the terms and redefine them and empower them so that our voices, the minority voices, comes through that unpacking of what is colonial. So the issue here is with the faces that I felt that in terms of my impetus for getting involved in the series is that this is an unpacking or exposure of the colonial model. Now, whether either one of those two views that you might come up with are both responses to the colonial model. So it's not, neither one stands outside the colonial model. And what I wanted to do in that unpacking is to say that if we consider these kinds of constructs, that we find failures, we find the things that that become false or become fiction. This is an articulation of taking over the colonial model. The articulated or the reveal of the fiction is the reveal made by the minority. That's what I felt, and so I thought that since I'd already established the fact that I thought my systems moved toward the arbitrary, then they would define as arbitrary the subjects of race and ethnicity.
So by the time we get to the last works in the series, where we're looking at the kind of composites of 12 different individuals, and each one of the 12 might define themselves as from 2 backgrounds, 3 backgrounds, 4 backgrounds. We're looking at 12 times 3 different ways that people have been asked to define themselves. And at that point, the whole idea of constructing yourself through racial identity or ethnic identity collapses. And with that collapse, the collapse of this colonial model, as you say, of having to define yourself in that way. Is that what you're, have I kind of spoken back to you in a way what you were saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way you describe my interest is so eloquent. You're right again. I just want to say that you describe it much better than I have. No, that in fact, I think that the idea of difference is very important, and that within the colonial space we are defined as differences. The issue is the application of a hierarchy to those differences, and I think that we can ameliorate that hierarchical structure without undermining those differences. Like for example, my son is mixed race. I thought it was nepotism to put him in the show and in the series, but he was very important for him to define himself culturally and socially as mixed race Black. because he was simply articulating his lived experience. You know, that his background is as much German as it is African American, but that gesture of articulating mixed race Black was an important one that responded, that conformed to his lived experience. Now, so at one time you are making this comment, by doing it, you're making this political comment about the critiquing the colonial model. But at the same time, you are, I feel that you're revealing that through that critique, that there is no universalizing proposition in defining difference.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions from our viewers now, and so please send them in, and then some will be filtered through to me. And the first one I'm going to read out is a question from H.K. Zamani, who says, "Since I'm a person of multicultural influences, the statement by Grace Jones interests me, that she wants to make work that is not identified by gender or race. Did you, Charles, at any time in your career make work that was motivated by the same?"
No, that's a nice question, because early in my career, I ran into this situation where I started working with numbers and systems, and I found myself in between two worlds. One where white people had trouble with me because my work didn't look Black enough, and then a certain African-American friends who were part of the Black Power movement thought my work looked white. And so I had to resolve this issue where my work stood in relation to that binary. And I mean, I came to the conclusion that my work was indeed a product of my lived experience, and by virtue of that, it was politically driven. But the terms the terms of identity expression with respect to work expanded beyond the normal tropes that people would assign, that white tropes and minority tropes. Went beyond because it's dealing with for the empathy and power, or empathy, or dealing with the politics of any kind of human condition. It can be a part of your lived experience and therefore be part of your Blackness. For example, the example that I give is that I had this interest in ontological and epistemological questions, these big questions that somehow it goes back to experiences I had when I was a kid, where I was asking such questions. And those questions came out of those questions of reality and what is reality came out of an experience I was having as a kid living in the Jim Crow South and experiencing racism. Questions of origins came to me. Right? So if I ask epistemological questions or ontological questions, I'm not acting white. I think I'm acting Black. I'm not trying to make non-work or non-work that doesn't identify with my identity. I'm trying to expand the terms by which I can claim experiences and ideas and claim them as part of my identity. So that if I'm Black and people think that I should make Black work, it doesn't mean that I have to make expressionist work of Black figures. That I can talk about abstract constructs as long as it comes out of my lived experience. And this is my interest. I was very interested in maintaining the idea of my difference.
Thank you, and I hope that's a great response. There's another question, which is it possible to make a work that's not beautiful using systems? And I want to add to that question, just a reflection on what you said before about, well, I just wanted to say that, as your work has grown in scale in the last few years, it's also grown in color and the sort of textures and colors that one finds in it. And especially, in the series that are here, they are stunning to look at. That is a shift, I think, that from the more the sort of drier, visually drier works that you were making in the 70s. There must be an enjoyment that you have in the textures, in the colors, and the scale of the works that you're making now that's different in category from the kind of pleasures that you took in the 70s looking at your own work, or am I off the mark?
Yeah, interesting, because one of the responses to those drawings of the 70s that they were beautiful, they were poetic. And this was, I mean, as I said, I always keep saying that it's not my intention to seduce the viewer through seductive affective strategies. But they were called that in relation to what was going on around. The conceptual artists of my time, or the previous generation of conceptual artists, and we have to say Lewitt is an exception, were pretty much trying to make their work as objective and as empirical as possible. They weren't interested in representation. I was interested in representation. Coming along with that, you are inviting poetry. Yeah. So if there's an affect that's communicated by the work, it's because I'm interrogating not just objects, but strategies of image making that people address. So when I got into using paint, then that became even exponentially greater, because the tools that I was using simply were more intense in terms of how to respond to it with our sensibilities. The question of can you make an ugly work with a system? Well, first of all, like beauty is a judgment, right? And that and it's done in context. There's no such thing as an absolute or universal articulation of beauty. It's always politically inscribed. Something is determined to be beautiful, and there's a whole politics around an ideology around that determination. So the strategy of using color in artwork makes you can't do anything ugly. I was trying to say that like with respect to music, that you can take a C note and an E note and play them together and they're harmonious. That harmony isn't the creation of the composer, it's implicit in the system. All right, now, so we try to take that harmony and put it in a context where we give it authority, right? So where it's just not a pleasure, but it might be something that is an experience that's forceful in the world. And that means that's the response to how that thing is that you're doing is contextualized within the larger scheme of the world. And so I think that I am using elements that you can't use badly. And I'm I'm using them to articulate certain things about representation. And what that gives me is this benefit of critiquing the idea of beauty. I mean, I wasn't originally starting out to do that. I was interested in critiquing self-expression and the subject, but I got more into understanding the tools that are used in art that's supposed to communicate self-expression. I found that as I critique those tools, I'm critiquing things that are in themselves already understood contextually as poetic or beautiful. And so I make no claim. I mean, if it's the effect of it is wonderful, because I love looking at them, so I can enjoy looking at them. So I'm not just trying to disable that experience of the work. And in fact, I think that if you can still find a critique while having that experience, I think it's even better.
Thank you. I'm going to read out another question now, which is about the change in the size of the panels midway through the series. So in the trees, there are, I think, 8 medium panels and then a jump on the 9th one. And in the faces surrounding me now, there are 12 and then a jump for 4 larger ones. What motivates the jump in size at a certain point in the series?
Originally, I first did a size jump in Los Angeles, my Los Angeles Hauser exhibition, when I worked on the palm tree series. And the interesting thing to say about that, back in ancient times when I started working on this, I was being influenced by the discourse around conceptual art, where there is this fear of I mean, I had this critique of subjectivity, but this fear of anything that is a fear of subjectivity, because they thought the tropes of subjectivity it had the intent of seducing you and including the concepts that are behind the work. And so one of the things was color. It was a great suspicion of color, except for Saul LeWitt, which I credit for helping me get out of this fear. But I was a young guy, and so I said, oh yeah, I want this work to have critical force. I shouldn't have color. So at a certain point, I said, like, that's garbage, and I started employing or using color as part of the systematic display. But there lingers in me this notion of being true to the system. I mean, it's built into me. And I have to constantly negotiate what the terms of being true to the system means. So for example, all my work was the same size because I was being true to the system. But then I came to this point where, I wanted to do something different. Like I wanted to make these like giant palm trees, but I didn't want the entire show to be these giant trees. And so I decided that, well, okay, I'll make the last 2 trees in the series much larger. And then I had to struggle with the idea, am I being, like dramatic? Is this a rigorous judgment or decision? And I thought that ultimately I might be lying to myself, but I thought that within the terms of some mathematical notions of extrapolation, the variability, that you can make these kinds of changes and still not undermine the system by some idea of a subjective intervention. And so that gave me license. Then that gave me license to do other things. It gave me license then to make the larger faces. And in the tree piece, it gave me license to do 2 different size trees in in that part of the exhibition we talked about earlier. It also gave me license to use the photograph in the background. I'm trying to push and explore the limits of the system while containing, operating within a set of rigors or constraints, so that the work isn't given over to my subjectivity.
Can I ask a very different question, then I'll come back to a couple of the audience. One of the things that's sort of legendary about you is you're teaching at CalArts, and I've worked with artists who are students of yours. For instance, I'm working with Laura Owens at the moment, and in the catalogue she published for her show at the Whitney, she included your sort of remarks on her progress during her M.F.A at CalArts. It was amazing to read what you said about her work, which I can't quite remember it now. But I wonder if some of the changes in your works over the years have come from teaching and watching what younger generations of artists have been doing. Because I think there's an amazing culture of teaching in Los Angeles, artists who are committed to teaching. And I wonder what it's given you to be in contact with new generations of artists.
Yeah, I mean, take this opportunity to advertise CalArts. I mean, I really, really think it's like one of the top 2 or 3 art schools in the world. And one of the things that it did for me was give me some really, really good students. And some people say that it's been reported that I'm old. And then when you think of old people, you think, well, their work, looks old. I don't know. And over the course of my career, people would always say that your work looks young. I attribute that to keeping a dialogue with those CalArts students. Now, there's this notion where, if that's true, that I would attribute it there. There's this notion that I had something to do with the career, not the career development, but the development of the work of some of the people that you're talking about who graduated from CalArts. And I always disclaim that. I always said that, it's like, like visiting the White House and saying that you're responsible for Biden, or I even make it voting for Biden, saying that your vote made Biden president. I was just there, and I was fortunate that a crew of really remarkably good students came through. So I say that, to the degree my work has remained alive, it's because of them, not because of anything I gave them.
Thank you. We've got a question from Jason Moran, and I'm thrilled that he's watching. So, and he says he loves the relationship between music harmony as implicit in the system. Can Charles talk about how he sees other implicit systems and how they find their way back into his work, especially as he's a percussionist and a composer?
Hi, Jason. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because I know some people may know that I'm also a musician. I was a professional drummer as a young person. I stopped playing professionally, but I learned music theory, and that my understanding of music allowed me to develop this series called the Manifestos. And there is and Manifestos revealed another kind of implicit affect, implicitly produced affect, and that is the relationship of words to notes. And one of the thing that is important to me with that series, and in my work in general, is this idea of the arbitrary. And in Manifestos, I create this arbitrary relationship between a text, a manifesto, and music. But I use a system to create that relationship or the link. In other words, the system translates the text into musical notation. Now, the result is completely affect driven. I mean, so these very hardcore political manifestos become quite sort of transcendent, sublime in terms of emotionality that you wouldn't find in simply dealing with the text. So the properties that music provides becomes so intertwined with the thoughts and ideas of the text that people think that link was intentional. And that's another instance where I say that it's built in. It has nothing to do with any insight I have. That, if you used to put a word up and then you put a sound up next to that word, you're going to draw a relationship. Whether it's beautiful depends upon the context you make the presentation. But as a raw substance, it's beautiful. I mean, it's like looking at a rock. It's just built into the system. The trick is, what are you going to do with this?
I remember seeing those manifestos, the 4 that were in the Hammer in one of the first, I think, Made in LA biennials. And I just thought they were extraordinary. Just the system of the music and the manifestos themselves. And it was very unexpected, the affects, I think, of the combination of the two. I just want to ask one last question, which is, the work I'm surrounded with can be thought of and interpreted in many different ways, but certainly I think what's clear is that it produces a very complex and nuanced understanding of what race might mean today. And sometimes the questions of race in the art world have become very reductive and very, very unnuanced. Do you think that this work surrounding me now holds out for a more nuanced approach to these questions that are surrounding us today?
Oh, yeah, you trying to get me in trouble? Let me say this, that, I did that in my class. Like, there's this suspicion about didactic art, and that idea, that critique, I think emanates, the issue of didacticism emanates from colonialism, that at least the effect of colonialism on the ideas of art, the constructs that come out of Kant and Hegel and Baumgarten and those people. And so we expect artworks to be multi-layered. And we expect by that we will have a complicated relationship with it. So there's some work that is dealing with a very specific project, which is, it's not complicated. And I embrace that, even if it's didactic. This is like for example, Henry Taylor's critique of police violence, for example. I don't, but one might say, well, this is, sort of a typical representational figuration of the Black political figure, which is sort of uncomplicated. And to me, it's extraordinarily complicated because it rethinks the manner in which, and the terms in which that very simple statement is being made. The problem that I have is that there is work that's based on stereotype, and there's work that is not. That both works can be very simple. I have the problem with work that's based upon stereotype of one form or another, and there's a lot of art that's done by white people that's stereotypical, but they're given a pass because they're white. And there are a lot of work done by Black artists that are more nuanced, but appears to be stereotyped because they're Black. And I think that's the problem, that with respect to representation of race, artists who deal with that subject aren't given the same kind of expansive leeway in dealing with that subject in terms of a focus critique in the way that that have been given to white artists, like Joseph Conrad's articulation of Africa is just ridden with stereotypes. But the public judgment of Conrad is that he's a remarkable poet, a remarkable writer of letters, but he's dealing with an over-the-top stereotype of a continent, and he's only given that pass because he's white.
Thank you. That's a great way to end, I think. And before we do end, I just want to say that it's been really a pleasure and an honor to speak with you this evening. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things. That the show surrounding me is on view until the 1st of May. So anyone who's in London, do make it down here to see these works. And it's open from Monday to Saturday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. If you're in the New York area, make it up to Deer Beacon, where there's a long-term view display of Charles, I think, sort of works from the 70s, which I think it's brilliant that those are on show at Deer, in and around artists with whom you were in dialogue back then, like Solowitz. And I'm most jealous not to be able to go to San Francisco because the installation at SF MoMA looks extraordinary. And congratulations to the curators there and to you, because it looks an incredible show that I guess people can check out on the SF MoMA website. But thank you so much, Charles. Sorry you didn't get to be here in person.
Yes, and Mark, I'm going to embarrass you again. I'm a fan. So it's such a thrill to have you interview me. It really is.
Cheers. Thank you.